You're listening to a CNA podcast.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff, and it's my favorite word.
That's US President-elect Donald Trump making the case for tariffs to Bloomberg in mid-October when he doubled down on his promise to impose levies on all imports into the United States. Now that Americans have returned Mr. Trump to the White House, Asia is bracing for disruptions to trade flows. And it's not just China that we're talking about. The Trump administration is likely to target any country with a large trade surplus with the United States, including Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. Malaysia in particular has benefited from companies that move part or all of the production to the country to avoid US tariffs on goods from China. Some fear the day of reckoning has arrived. I'm Arnold Gay, and this is the CNA Correspondent podcast. Joining me on the show is our Malaysia correspondent, Melissa Goh. Mel, thank you very much for joining us. Good to see you.
Yep, nice to be here.
Mel, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So how important is the United States as a trading partner and investor to Malaysia? Give us a sense, some of the numbers perhaps.
US is the top investor for Malaysia and provide the largest source of FDI for years, mostly in the E&E sectors and the oil and gas. It's not the biggest trading partner, though, China is, for 15 consecutive years. But US is among the top 3 or 4. Now, Malaysia has been consistently maintaining a trade surplus with US hovering around 30 to 35 billion US dollars. And that may be a problem under Trump 2.0 administration. Why? Because one of the main thrusts of his policy is to rein in the huge deficit and protect jobs in America. Now, it remains to be seen what measures that his administration is going to impose to countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia that have been running huge trade surpluses with the US. We can only guess for now because he has warned during his campaign trail that he will impose 10% tariffs on all imports and 60% or more on Chinese goods. But as to what exactly the scope and the scale, we'll have to wait to see.
So let's try and take a little bit of the guesswork away from this if we can, Mel. Which industries are most likely to take a hit from higher US tariffs?
Essentially, Malaysia is very trade reliant and it's an export-driven economy, right? Where trade accounts for about 150% of the country's GDP. Any slowdown or any disruption in the global supply chain is going to impact the economy. Now, so far, it's been benefiting from these trade tensions between US and China. Now, many manufacturers we've seen, especially in the E&E sectors, the semiconductor industry, they have relocated to Malaysia, to Penang, to Johor, and they have relocated to avoid the trade restrictions so far because Malaysia is seen as a neutral ground and it has relatively a good infrastructure, abundance of land here, resources, and a ready pool of English-speaking workforce. But will things change under Trump administration? That's the concern uppermost in the minds of many I spoke with. Already we're seeing how severe these tariffs imposed on solar panel affected the industry, affected the manufacturers in Southeast Asia. Now, Malaysia's solar equipment exported to the US was slapped with a slightly over 9% duty. And for those from Thailand, faces a whopping 23% import duty. Now, almost all the manufacturers I spoke with had to roll back their production. Now, they said that the more they sell, the more they lose. Now, Chinese-owned Jinko Solar in Penang has already shut its operation and moved to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, they told me. But here's the thing. G Crystal, which is also Chinese-owned, supplies solar glass to the US PV makers here called First Solar, and they said they're fine. So there are ways to get around it. LONGi, which is the largest listed solar PV maker in China, they told me that they have 3 plants here in Malaysia. They're going to stay put. There's a huge stockpile, no doubt. The key is innovation. They said the company is now pushing to produce a next generation of PVs to stay afloat. Now, as to what industry next is going to be targeted, nobody really knows for sure. I asked the Malaysia Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry, Zafrul Aziz, and he doesn't have the answer, I'm afraid. Let's take a listen.
US have imposed tariff on solar panels for some companies, especially companies who are manufacturing in Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, as well as Vietnam. There are various reasons given to us, so we are now helping the companies by getting more information and then engaging the Department of Commerce to ensure that Department of Commerce of the United States to see how we can support these companies.
Will it affect our investment, attracting our more investment?
On the solar side, yes, of course, right? So,
Will it go to affect chip in the end?
no, I don't think
You don't
so.
think it will-
Yeah, I
it
don't
will
think so. I think you know
spread
better.
to
Maybe you can
semicon?
talk to them.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you,
Mel.
Mel.
Good try, Mel.
Well, you
It seems he doesn't really know. But here's a distinct possibility. It could be a blanket tariff. You were saying it could be 10, it could be 20, it could be even 60 if it's a Chinese company based in Malaysia. You've spoken to CEOs, you've spoken to business leaders. What are they telling you? Are they afraid? Are they hopeful? What have they been saying to each other when they meet?
If Trump's goal is to protect American business at all costs, a blanket tariffs on all the imported goods will hurt not just Malaysia, but across the world, right? A slowing China is hurting the country's exports already. Now, we just spoke about how trade reliant the economy is. US is a major market, especially for E&E sector. They account for over 40% of the country's exports, and they hire about 500,000 people, and they are going to be affected if E&E is going to be targeted. Now, some industry experts told me that Chinese companies that assembled the equipment, the servers, and so on in Malaysia, and then export to US, they may come under the radar of the Commerce Department in the US if they haven't. And if a first Trump administration is anything to go by, the market is in for some rough ride. That's former Deputy Trade Minister Ong Kian Ming most worried about.
A Trump 2.0 presidency will have much more unpredictable and also punitive tariff measures that can be implemented at a very short notice against countries in Southeast Asia. Punitive actions will be fast and furious.
Okay, so some real worries, some reason for concern there. Mel, I want to ask you next about firms which offshore. There are many firms who do that in Malaysia. The Chinese firms, which are trying to disguise the origin of their products by relocating operations outside China. These are, I guess, fairly obvious targets. But I'm interested to know, what about foreign companies, non-Chinese firms, which have been there for some time, names like Intel, Micron, Infineon? What's going to happen to them?
I did a quick check with some of them. The semiconductors is a long-term game. They said many like Intel, Micron, they have announced billions of investments and projects across the region. They said every geography works to complement each other. It's like a big piece of a jigsaw puzzle, they said. So they are going to stay put, regardless the change of administration in the US. That's what they told me. Despite the US CHIPS Act, the call by Trump for reshoring, to bring their business back, to protect jobs. Now, Transport Minister Anthony Loke shares a similar optimism. Let's have a listen.
But as you know, we have major US companies based here in Malaysia that are re-exporting back to the US on microchips, on semiconductors, E&E, and so forth. So I'm not that pessimistic about it.
Okay, Mel, two parties which seem to be quite optimistic, but supposing Trump 2.0 is a little bit more, if you like, severe than expected. Is there a danger to Malaysia's hopes of becoming a global technology hub, for example, by attracting semiconductor firms and data centers? Are these plans in any danger of being derailed if we see a global trade war?
Well, I spoke with the senior state officials from northern state of Penang to the southern state of Johor. It's business as usual, they're telling me. Malaysia is the sixth largest exporter of semiconductors and packages almost a quarter of all the chips in America. So for a small state like Penang and neighboring Guilin High-Tech Park, they really punches above their weight because they account for 13% of the global assembly, packaging and testing market. But so far, it's been focusing a lot on back-end activities. And the government, led by Prime Minister Anwar, he has big plans. He wants to move the industry to front-end, to the advanced packaging, testing, and perhaps to integrated circuit design and wafer fab later on. So it requires a lot of high-value, high-growth investments from tech companies. Now, so far, Malaysia has successfully raised its visibility, created a lot of noise, and attracted billions of investments from the US tech giants, from Intel, AWS, Microsoft, Microsoft, Nvidia, Google, Oracle, you name it. And down south in Johor, 15 data centers, different stages of completion. And the state expects more investors to come in from Singapore once this agreement on the SEZ, the Special Economic Zone, is signed by early December. And that is on track. So far, so good. A senior official was telling me that there is no indication that things are going to change or it's going to be a slowdown or adversely affected at all.
I'm glad you brought up the Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, because to Donald Trump, it seems personal rapport is very important. So I'm wondering, does the PM have a relationship with the incoming American president? Or if not directly, is there someone in the Malaysian government who has close ties, who can put in a few good words here and there, arrange a few meetings or the right meetings and head off any potential problems down the road?
Although Trump and Anwar, they have not met, I was told. I was speaking with the Malaysian ambassador to the US, Nazri Aziz. He doesn't see it as a problem, even though Prime Minister Anwar, he doesn't play golf, but he is very amicable. And Trump's administration is going to be fine with Malaysia's tough stance, he said, against Israel, especially in the Gaza conflict. And in fact, he even calls for more Malaysian companies to consider setting up operations in the United States if they were so worried about possible tariffs. Now, Trump is a businessman. Everybody knows that. And he pointed out that glove makers like Supermax, Top Glove, they have operations already in the US to be close to their customers. Now, Prime Minister Anwar is seen as leaning, and everybody said so, that leaning towards China, pivoting towards China with recent visits to Beijing, to Shanghai, reaffirming China as a trusted friend and so on. But is that going to be a problem, honestly? And now I asked the ambassador, and Ambassador Nazri said, not at all. Malaysia wants to be good friends with everyone, with US and China, with everyone. It's not a question who is a better friend or a best friend. Now, in fact, he looks towards inviting Trump to the ASEAN summit next year. And although he thinks that his deputy Vance is more likely to go.
Okay, so far, Mel, you've spoken to quite a number of policymakers, business leaders as well. And we've heard from them apparently some optimism that things aren't going to be so bad. But I'm curious, is the Anwar government trying actively or preparing, if you like, to preempt a possible tariff shock and looking at ways to minimize the impact? What are the real options, policy options available to Malaysia right now?
There's no perfect contingency plan here. And Prime Minister Anwar, he knows it. Now, he's been the country's #1 salesman. He's been traveling. Malaysia, he said, needs to diversify from its traditional markets. He's now in the Middle East, I was told. He will be in South America attending APEC and then later on G20 Summit. Next year is going to be a busy one. On top of ASEAN Summit, there's also the ASEAN GCC plus China Summit, where these 6 countries in the Middle East, the Gulf nations, going to be getting involved. It's a first. This was initiated by Prime Minister Anwar himself to bring the region closer. He said ASEAN, he said, can be a link between the Middle East and China. ASEAN needs to diversify, as I mentioned, from the traditional markets, and BRICS partnership is one way to widen market access, he said. Now, in fact, ASEAN, with a combined population of over 670 million now, it's the 5th largest economy. It's huge market potential, but there are challenges because each country has different stages of development, different standards, and sharing with information has been difficult, I was told. Now, currently, intra-ASEAN trade accounts for less than a quarter of total trade among ASEAN member countries. US and China, they both make up about 30%. So ASEAN needs to get its act together to establish some sort of a platform, a linkage for all the relevant industry in ASEAN member countries to start looking perhaps with semicon, who knows, to have this platform and this collaboration. Who knows, we may just create ASEAN first 100% made ASEAN product, like something small like a drone, if not an EV, to show that ASEAN can come together and have their own supply chain, their own ecosystem, without having to rely on these major markets.
That would be very interesting. Mel, I know you've been talking to analysts as well about the impact on the Malaysian ringgit. Tariffs not likely to be good for it, and has been one of the best performing currencies this year as well. So I'm curious, we know for one thing that the tariffs may not take immediate effect. There may be some negotiations, some hardball being played before some actual announcements are made towards the end of next year by the US. So what are analysts saying about the likely impact on the ringgit? And how badly would a weak ringgit derail Mr. Anwar's economic agenda? We know that he's planning to roll back fuel subsidies by the middle of next year.
Well, indeed, the ringgit was the top performing currency. In the third quarter from July to September this year, we saw it gain like over 10% against the greenback. But it's since retreated. Almost half of its gains hovering now around 4.3, 4.4 to $1. Now, the concern is that the second Trump administration is going to trigger further inflation with corporate tax cut and import tariffs and so on. And the Fed may not be able to cut rates. So the differentials between US and Malaysia interest rates may not narrow further now. So if it widens to curb inflation back home, then more money is going to leave Malaysia, and this flight to safety back to the greenback is going to be bad news and it's going to weaken the ringgit, unfortunately. But the central bank governor, Abdul Rashid Ghaffur, was quick to allay market concerns. He said Bank Negara will be closely monitoring the situation, the global developments, and stand ready to manage any spillover to domestic market to ensure there's sufficient, he said, liquidity in the market, in the domestic forex market. Now, if the ringgit weakens, more people are going to feel the pain with the rising prices, coupled with oil prices that may soar. It's going to be double whammy. It's going to be so difficult for Prime Minister Arnold to implement any significant subsidy cut on petrol, even though it's only meant to affect the top 15% of the population, the income earners, the wealthy lot. But as it is, there's hardly any buy-in from the people on the subsidy rollback. So implementation is going to be tricky.
Right. Mel, one possible scenario as well is if Chinese products are completely shut out of US markets because of, 60% tariffs, for example. Is there concern that Malaysia will struggle because there's going to be a flood of cheap Chinese goods going into the country and competing with local producers and manufacturers?
There are concerns, not just in Malaysia, in many countries in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia too, the governments that are reviewing their anti-dumping legislations, Malaysia as well, to better protect their own local industries against such dumping activities. Now, in fact, legal action has been taken in the past against some Chinese companies on iron and steel products. As we speak, several anti-dumping investigations are ongoing on the building materials after receiving petitions from local SMEs. Now, I spoke with the Selangor State Exco for Investment and Trade, Ng Zihan, recently, and he is aware of that. And the Trade Ministry and the relevant authorities are constantly monitoring the situation on the ground. And this is what he said.
We also need to take some prevention that we do not want to become a dumping ground of the excessive products in China. They have excessive stocks in certain items, especially for hardware items. Hardware, yeah. Construction hardware, building materials. Because the construction market in China is slowing down a lot and they have excessive supply. So then we need to find balance. We still need to protect the local SMEs. Yeah.
So I spoke with the Trade Ministry. They said that if things get worse and they might be looking at perhaps some sort of a war being set up in Malaysia to prevent an influx of cheap goods, if indeed happens, in order to protect our own industries and SMEs.
So literally a trade war. That cannot be good for world trade as well.
I'm not a war.
A war?
A war. A war. Because when I talk to the trade, said, we might have to look at some sort of a war, set up a war, the green war, the blue. But then this is said that this is because building materials, because of a slowdown in China, lots of building cement, steel, everything is coming in and it's hurting our Malaysian industry. So they may be considering setting up some sort of a war to prevent an influx of cheap products coming from China, especially in the building materials.
Okay. Mel, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks, Arnold. And
that is the CNA Correspondent podcast this week. A reminder, you can catch reports from all our correspondents on CNA's YouTube channel and CNA.Asia. And please note, the TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. The team behind this week's edition is Sa Ye Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, Craig Dale, Tiffany Ang, and myself, Arnold Gay. Thank you very much for joining us.